Hello friends, I hope you are having a good Advent season so far, and during this second week of Advent that we are now in, we are also continuing our journey through the Gospel of Luke. As a brief summary up to this point, Luke's Gospel, of course, began with the stories of Jesus' birth and John's birth, the stories that we think about so much during this season right now. Then Jesus was baptized and tempted and began his ministry in Galilee. He called his first disciples. He healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law and then a whole bunch of other people at her house, at Peter's house. He healed a leper. He healed a man whose friends had to open up the roof on top of the house to let him down in front of Jesus. And then in chapter 6, Jesus began what Luke describes as a sermon on a level place, comparable to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. And just like Matthew's version, there are blessings and woes, or beatitudes as we often refer to them. There are teachings about loving our enemies, about not judging others, about bearing good fruit in our lives, and here building our house or our life on the foundation of Jesus' teaching. After the sermon, there were more healings, like the centurion's servant and the widow's son who had died. Jesus forgave a sinful woman who was bathing his feet with her tears at a Pharisee's house. Jesus gave life to a panicked father's daughter who died on their way to heal her, but Jesus healed her from afar. And in the midst of that whole story, Jesus also healed a woman who touched his cloak and had been bleeding for many years, but that stopped and she was healed. Jesus also talked about sowing seed, the seed of the kingdom, and that a lamp should not be hidden but should be put up where all can see. Jesus walked on water and fed 5,000 hungry people and was transfigured up on that mountain in front of Peter, James, and John. Eye-opening displays of power, for sure. But Jesus also began to tell his disciples in the midst of all of this that he would soon suffer and die. After which, unfortunately, some of them began to argue about which of them would get to be the greatest in his kingdom. Jesus was then teaching his disciples and even sent them out in his name to heal and to teach themselves. But they were clearly not fully understanding, or at least accepting, or both, of this way of Jesus. And then there was the parable of the Good Samaritan about who is a good neighbor, and Jesus' teaching about the Lord's Prayer. After which we arrive here at chapter 12, about the midpoint of the gospel. So in this chapter, I'll just mention three quick things. First, in Jesus' parable about the rich fool, where it says in our translations tend to say that he thought to himself, or he began to calculate, but the literal meaning is he debated with himself, which seems to go along better with what he says a couple of verses later, and I will say to my soul. That wording seems to point to those internal conversations we have, almost the little arguments we have with ourselves. Our own rationalization of why we do what we do, why we do this or that, or how we think about something. We almost have to rationalize our way into it. And we can rationalize just about anything. But the man is clearly self-centered and focused on his own great life and his own stuff, and he rationalizes why that should be. but he is not, as Jesus says, rich toward God. Jesus then gives a teaching about not being so worried and focused about our stuff. God will provide everything that we need, and instead we should, he says, sell our possessions, be generous towards those in need, or give alms, as it says, and thereby store up treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Perhaps this Advent, as we wait for how Jesus will show up in our lives and will want us to be a part of what he is doing, his work, his way in the world, we should think a little about where our focus is currently. So then, fittingly, Jesus tells two parables about servants being watchful for the coming or the return of their master. That's exactly what we do during Advent. And lastly, Jesus notes that his coming will bring division. But from all that we have read so far in this gospel, I don't think the kind of division that we experience, much of which has to do with politics or social views, or if you are my kind of person or not, I don't think any of this is a kind of division that Jesus is talking about. We soon discover that the kind of divisions that Jesus causes is based in how willing and ready we are and people are to follow his ways. And that willingness cuts through, I think, the center of political parties and families and even churches. Perhaps this waiting that we're doing right now during Advent should make us a little worried. So be watchful this week, my friends, and I will see you soon. Amen.